Where Have You Gone, Charming Billy by Tim O'Brien. The platoon of 26 soldiers moved slowly in the dark single file, not talking. One by one, like sheep in a dream, they passed through the hedgerow, crossed quietly over a meadow, and came down to the rice paddy. There they stopped. Their leader knelt down, motioning with his hand, and one by one, the other soldiers squatted in the shadows, vanishing in the primitive stealth of warfare. For a long time, they did not move, except for the sounds of their breathing. The 26 men were very quiet, some of them excited by the adventure, some of them afraid, some of them exhausted from the long night march, some of them looking forward to reaching the sea, where they would be safe. At the rear of the column, Private First Class Paul Berlin lay quietly with his forehead resting on the black plastic stock of his rifle, his eyes closed. He was pretending he was not in the war, pretending he had not watched Billy Boy Watkins die of a heart attack that afternoon. He was pretending he was a boy again, camping with his father in the midnight summer along the Des Moines River. In the dark, with his eyes pinched shut, he pretended. He pretended that when he opened his eyes, his father would be there by the campfire, and they would talk softly about whatever came to mind, and then roll into their sleeping bags, and that later they'd wake up and it would be morning, and there would not be a war, and that Billy Boy Watkins had not died of a heart attack that afternoon. He pretended he was not a soldier. In the morning, when they reached the sea, it would be better. The hot afternoon would be over. He would bathe in the sea, and he would forget how frightened he had been on his first day at the war. The second day would not be so bad. He would learn. So we have some important things that's happened here already. We know what our main character's name is, Private First Class Paul Berlin. Now I want you to think about what we've learned so far. It's very important to know that we're already in a war and that he watched Billy Boy Watkins die of a heart attack. That doesn't seem like something that you would hear. It seems weird to hear that a soldier dies of a heart attack. Also, this is Private First Class Paul Berlin's first day. Sounds like a tough one. Continuing. There was a sound beside him, a movement, then a breathed, "Hey!" He opened his eyes, shivering as if emerging from a deep nightmare. "Hey!" A shadow whispered, "We're moving! Get up!" "Okay." "You sleeping or something?" "No." He could not make out the soldier's face. With clumsy, concrete hands, he clawed for his rifle, found his helmet. The soldier shadow grunted. "You got a lot to learn, buddy. I'd shoot you if I thought you was sleeping. Let's go." Private First Class Paul Berlin blinked. One of the important things that we want to look at with the way Tim O'Brien writes here is he uses a lot of something called alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of the consonant sound at the beginning of the words. So if we look at the previous sentence, we have clumsy, concrete hands, and then we have he clawed. Then the next sentence here, we have the S's repeating with the shoulder and the shadow. Makes for me have a difficult time to say those. Continuing. Ahead of him, silhouetted against the sky, he saw the string of soldiers wading into the paddy, the black outline of their shoulders and packs and weapons. He was comfortable. He did not want to move, but he was afraid, for it was his first night at the war, so he hurried to catch up, stumbling once, scraping his knee, groping as though blind. His boots sank into the thick, paddy water, and he smelled it all around him. He would tell his mother how it smelled: mud and algae and cattle manure and chlorophyll, decay, breeding mosquitoes and leeches as big as mice. The fecund warmth of the paddy waters rising up to his cut knee. But he would not tell how frightened he had been. Once they reached the sea, things would be better. They would have their rear guarded by 3,000 miles of ocean, and they would swim and dive in the breakers and hunt crayfish and smell the salt, and they would be safe. This is the second time that he's referred to things being better if they reach the sea. I wonder if they actually will be better when he reaches the sea. So I'm going to write that down. I get the feeling that things aren't going to all of a sudden miraculously become better just because they get to the sea. He followed the shadow of the man in front of him. It was clear night. Already the Southern Cross was out. And other stars he could not yet name. Soon, he thought, he would learn their names. And puffy night clouds. There was not yet a moon. So we're going to take a pause here so that we can look at the previous picture. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over. So I want you to write down in the margin what you see here. Okay, and things that I want you to think about in terms of what you write down is you might think about the body language, who this is, how do they look, and what does it say about this person? Think about it in terms of what do you think is happening. These are the things that I want you to write down in the margin as you are thinking about the story. Now we'll continue. Wading through the paddy, his boots made sleepy sloshing sounds. We have this alliteration again. Sleepy, sloshing sounds, like a lullaby. And he tried not to think. Though he was afraid, he now knew that fear came in many degrees and types and peculiar categories. And he knew that his fear now was not so bad as it had been in the hot afternoon when poor Billy Boy Watkins got killed by a heart attack. His fear now was diffuse and unformed. Ghosts in the tree line, nighttime fears of a child, a boogeyman in the closet that his father would open to show empty, saying, "See, nothing there, champ. Now you can sleep." In the afternoon, it had been worse. The fear had been bundled and tight, and he'd been on his hands and knees, crawling like an insect, an ant escaping a giant's footsteps and thinking nothing, brain flopping like wet cement in a mixer, not thinking at all, watching while Billy Boy Watkins died. One thing that's interesting about Tim O'Brien's style here is if we look at this is one sentence. That's very important, and how many times he uses "and." He's showing you how confused, how his brain is working for Paul Berlin here, and how difficult of a time that he's having. Now as he stepped out of the paddy onto a narrow dirt path, now the fear was mostly the fear of being so terribly afraid again. So he's afraid of fear. He tried not to think. There are tricks he learned to keep from thinking. Counting. He counted his steps, concentrating on the numbers, pretending that steps were dollar bills, and that each step through the night made him richer and richer, so that soon he would become a wealthy man. And he kept counting and considered the ways he might spend the money after the war and what he would do. He would look his father in the eye and shrug and say, "It was pretty bad at first, but I learned a lot and got used to it." Then he would tell his father the story of Billy Boy Watkins. But he would never let on how frightened he had been. Not so bad, he would say instead, making his father feel proud. Here again, we were understanding that we hold certain things back. We don't admit to our fears. Songs, another trick to stop from thinking. Where have you gone, Billy boy, Billy boy? Oh, where have you gone, charming Billy? I have gone to seek a wife, she's the joy of my life, but she's a young thing and cannot leave her mother. And other songs that he sang in his thoughts as he walked toward the sea. And when he reached the sea, he would dig a deep hole in the sand. He would sleep in the high clouds, and he would not be afraid anymore. Once again, we hear this concept of the sea. Okay, and the sea to him means safety. But what do we know about war? And especially the Vietnam War and what we've learned. Vietnam wasn't safe. Anytime. The moon came out, pale and shrunken to the size of a dime. The helmet was heavy on his head. Remember how I told you about that alliteration? Here again we have it with the H's. Helmet, heavy, his, head. This is one of the reasons why I loved Tim O'Brien. This concept of using alliteration in his storytelling makes it very beautiful. It rolls off the tongue in a way. And other times, like the S's, it makes your tongue trip up as you're trying to read. And it makes sense why sometimes the alliteration makes the story go faster, and sometimes it makes it go slower. It helps you get into the head of the character, which is the most important thing of this story, is trying to get into the head of this young first-class soldier, Paul Berlin, on his very first day at war. In the morning, he would adjust the leather binding. He would clean his rifle too, even though he had been frightened to shoot it during the hot afternoon. He would carefully clean the breech and the muzzle and the ammunition so that next time he would be ready and not so afraid. In the morning, when they reached the sea, he would begin to make friends with some of the other soldiers. He would learn their names and laugh at their jokes. Then when the war was over, he would have war buddies, and he would write to them once in a while and exchange memories. Look again, we have W's here. War, was, would, war, write, while. Walking, sleeping in his walking, he felt better. He watched the moon come higher. Notice that Paul Berlin is doing anything to avoid what's really going on. Once they skirted a sleeping village, the smells again. Straw, cattle, mildew. The men were quiet. On the far side of the village, buried in the dark smells, a dog barked. The column stopped until the barking died away. Then they marched fast away from the village, through a graveyard filled with conical-shaped burial mounds and tiny altars made of clay and stone. The graveyard had a perfumey smell. A nice place to spend the night, he thought. The mounds would make fine battlements, and the smell was nice, and the place was quiet. Okay, remember what our concept of irony is here. It's ironic that where does he want to sleep? That's right, he wants to sleep in a graveyard, in a cemetery. He talks about how it smells nice and how it would be great to protect yourself by the mounds. Well, those mounds are actually dead bodies buried. Okay, so it's ironic that the concept of him wanting to stay in the graveyard when he is alive is coming into play here. But they went on, passing through a hedgerow and across another paddy and east toward the sea. He walked carefully. He remembered what he'd been taught. Stay off the center of the path. 4, that was where the landmines and booby traps were planted, where stupid and lazy soldiers like to walk. Stay alert, he'd been taught. Better alert than inert. Agile, mobile, hostile. Notice if we look at these with the 6 and the 7 here, okay, both of these are sayings that they would have been taught to say over and over again. They're chants reminding soldiers to be light on their feet, agile, ready to move, mobile, and aggressive, hostile. If you hear agile, mobile, hostile, these are things that also we might hear in chants from a sporting event. I remember these chants from watching the movie Remember the Titans, and they would say this exact one, agile, mobile, hostile. It's interesting that we're connecting a football movie to the war, and it seems kind of weird to connect the two. But both of them are chants that are taught to teach young men how to act under pressure. He wished he'd paid better attention to the training. He could not remember what they'd said about how to stop being afraid. They hadn't given him any lessons in courage, not that he could remember, and they hadn't mentioned how Billy Boy Watkins would die of a heart attack, his face turning pale and the veins popping out. We're going to pause here, and I'm going to start the next video so we don't have too long of ones.